When we lived in Okinawa, we lived in the city of Uruma. We often visited the street that this young woman was abducted from because it had the mega store Don Quixote, a pretty spectacular row of restaurants, and the Japanese equivalent of an IKEA. One night as we were driving back from either running errands or getting food, my eyes wandered to the side of the road where a young Japanese woman was walking. She wore heels. She had headphones in both ears. She had her phone out and was distracted by it and wore her hair in a tight ponytail. As I watched, she took a right-hand turn down a poorly lit alleyway. It became abundantly clear that the United States, where I'd grown up, had taught me a different set of skills that I needed in order to stay safe, or safe enough, so that I wouldn't be blamed if something happened to me. This young woman endured no such lesson and was able to walk unconcerned about her own safety in an area where the unthinkable had actually already happened, maybe 5 years beforehand. She didn't clutch her keys in between her knuckles in some measure of self-defense. She seemed unconcerned that her ponytail would be easy for an assailant to yank all at once. She was engrossed in her cell phone and had both headphones in. She couldn't hear her surroundings. She walked by herself at night down a dark alley without fear. No head on a swivel, no furtive glances over her shoulders or trying to remember license plates for cars that drove a little too close or a little too slow, or that circled the block and came back. I often wonder what that life would be like. A life where I felt 100% safe in public spaces while growing up. Some people stationed in Japan make an effort to stay as long as possible. They don't have to worry about gun violence, and they have this overwhelming sense of safety and security. One former service member did just that, separating from the Marine Corps and moving to Okinawa. Kenneth Franklin Gadson Shinzato worked as a contract employee on the Kadena Air Force Base in Okinawa, Japan. Gadson leveraged that incredible sense of safety possessed by Japanese women and kidnapped and murdered a young woman, abandoning her body in a suitcase. This is Conduct Unbecoming. I'm Erin, and I'm your host. In 2007, the Marine Corps stationed Kenneth Franklin Gadson on Okinawa. It was his first duty station. Months earlier, while joining the Marine Corps, he shared that he wanted to become a Marine because he wanted to kill people, which, if true, apparently did not bar his service. In Okinawa, he worked in the 3rd Battalion, 12th Marines mail room. I think that placed him either on Camp Hansen or Camp Schwab in the northern half of Okinawa. By the time the Marine Corps PCS'd him back to the United States in 2011, Gadson was enamored. He separated from the Marine Corps in 2014, then moved back to Okinawa to re-immerse himself in the soba and sushi, and of course, dating local women. While we were in Okinawa, my spouse and I had heard this rumor that there's an American brunch place down on the seawall, down near American Village. American Village is an area where American troops landed in the 1945 Battle of Okinawa, and now plays host to a bunch of restaurants that feel kind of like home but not. Think A&W Root Beer, Red Lobster, and 1950s, 1960s kitsch. Breakfast options that felt like home were pretty hard to come by, so we were excited to go and try the place. I'd give the breakfast an America 4, but an Okinawa 9. The true highlight was eavesdropping on a double date the next table over. 2 excited young American men were explaining in rapid English to their Japanese dates all about their time at boot camp. The 2 young men explained how thoroughly they had to clean everything, miming, pressing their earnest faces against a mirror to check from that angle to see if there were errant fingerprints that they needed to clean up. They described the tidiness of their room, the efficiency of their meals, and the physical tasks they'd completed before graduating. The women made non-committal murmurs that the service members took as encouragement to keep describing how taut the corners of their sheets should be. There was a language barrier all around, but it was pretty clear that the women weren't as interested in these two young men anymore. I don't know if that's how Gadson's dates went, though we can assume he met someone who liked him well enough because he married a local Okinawan woman. Gadson elected to take his wife's last name, Shinzato, to further adapt to his new home country. I'm going to continue to refer to him as Gadson, however, because I think it gets confusing to change names mid-story. Upon returning to Okinawa, Gadson began working as an IT services contractor for what I assume is MBC on Kadena Air Force Base. They provided internet and cable TV to service members. Japan is widely considered to be one of the most ethnically homogeneous countries in the world. In fact, they perceive themselves to be monoethnic, though there are small minority groups, including the natives of Okinawa and Hokkaido, Japan's northernmost island. I switch back and forth in this episode between referring to the locals on Okinawa as Okinawan and Japanese, because I like variety and see it as the same thing as referring to someone as a Coloradan or an American. That's not necessarily the prevailing sentiment in Japan, where official reports regarding human trafficking, for instance, maintain a distinction between the women of Okinawa, Hokkaido, and the rest of Japan. I offer all of this detail to share that assimilation is not easy. And although Gadson changed his name, assimilation was never going to be easy for him because Gadson is first American. In Okinawa, there's a word for women who like American men, amejo. Ame as in American, and jo from the Okinawan word jogu, to have an appetite for. Local women attracted to black men like Gadson are referred to as kokuju. I got the sense that Japan still enjoys its homogeneity, and I can't imagine that navigating it as a black American or an interracial couple was or is easy. That said, this is all just informational, and I don't feel empathy for Gadson given the choices that he made. On the evening of April 28, 2016, Gadson climbed into his car and began to drive around. He didn't have a particular destination in mind, just a goal. He drove for 2 or 3 hours before finding his opportunity. That same evening, Rina Shimabukuro texted her boyfriend that she was going for a walk. She changed out of her house slippers, laced up her red sneakers, and set off from their shared apartment. Then she disappeared. Another text Rina received from her boyfriend was marked red, though it went unanswered. The following day, her boyfriend reported her missing, and local police began to search for her, combing through Uruma, the area around her apartment. At first, some thought Rina had been abducted by a religious cult. Others naturally assumed Rina's boyfriend was involved in her disappearance. When Gadson passed Rina while he was out on his long drive, he claims he heard a voice tell him that she was the one. She was the one that could fulfill his fantasy. You see, when he climbed into his red SUV and began driving around that April evening, he was trying to find the perfect victim to fulfill his fantasy of abducting and raping a local Okinawan woman. He wanted it to be a Japanese woman because, as a Japanese government survey revealed a couple years earlier, less than 1/3 of rape victims ever spoke about their assault to others, and only 4% reported their assault to the police. This could be why women, when asked if they would rather run into a bear or a man while they're alone in the woods, would choose the bear. There's a 0% chance that the bear clambered into the woods, intent on making anyone a victim. Seeing Rena walking alone and reportedly hearing some internal voice validating his decision, Gadson pulled over. He planned to knock her unconscious with a stick, shove her limp body into a suitcase he had waiting in his trunk, and take her to a hotel to rape her. The sequence of events are a little unclear. Gadson did hit Rena over the head with a stick, and, seeing a car in the distance and fearing being caught in the headlights, he dragged Rena back further from the road, which again knocked her head. When Rena tried to speak, Gadson began choking her before she went limp. Gadson retrieved the suitcase from his car and began to put the next phase of his twisted plan into action. But Rena didn't stir, and Gadson began to believe that she might be dead. Instead of checking for her pulse or watching to see if she was breathing, Gadson stabbed her in the neck to determine if she was really dead. What's unclear is whether this is the first time that Gadson stabbed her, and whether this stabbing took place at the roadside or when Gadson dumped Rena's body. Gadson, whose only asserted boundary seems to be necrophilia, was not able to satisfy his fantasy about raping a kidnapped woman, and instead abandoned Rena's dead body stuffed into that suitcase in a wooded area nearby. Back at the riverside, Gadson had taken her keys and phone, and then threw them both into the river along with the stick that he'd hit Rena with. After abandoning Rena's body, Gadson drove home to his wife and young child, fearful that he'd be identified and arrested within days. But days turned into weeks, and Gadson began to believe that he'd gotten away with murder. He watched the daily coverage of Rena's disappearance, but continued his life, unburdened by his crimes. Gadson later revealed details about his life growing up in New York City, and the details made it clear how he was able to compartmentalize his violence. It was practice. He said as a child he'd heard voices, that he'd been treated for ADHD and socialized non-aggressive conduct disorder, which is usually characterized by aggression, property destruction, and deceitfulness. The fantasies about kidnapping and raping women began in high school. He believed some women were good, and that others were sneaky and his enemy. As a teenager, he was often physically violent towards his mother and foster mother. Local police reviewed security camera footage from the Uruma area and identified 300 separate vehicles in the area around the time when they believed Rena went missing. About 3 weeks after Rena's disappearance on May 19, 2016, police contacted Gadson as the owner and driver of that red SUV they saw on the camera footage. Gadson confessed that he'd been driving around and that he'd spotted a girl walking. He admitted to pulling over and assaulting her. Then he led them to the suitcase in the woods. I think describing tree-dense areas in Okinawa as wooded is technically true, but they aren't the crisp, cool forests of the Pacific Northwest or Appalachia. Okinawa is in the subtropics. The wooded areas are full of face-sized spiders and venomous pit viper habu snakes. But more importantly, the humid heat is stifling and oppressive and feels like a thick, wet blanket you can't shake until January and February when you finally get some relief. That sticky heat had sped up decomposition, and by the time Rena's body was discovered, it was already nearly completely skeletonized, and Rena was unrecognizable. She was identified by her dental records. Police arrested Gadson on suspicion of illegally disposing of a body. Gadson began asserting that he confessed because he'd attempted to die by suicide and was still impaired by the sleeping pills he took. He also claimed that he was competent enough to feel that he was not treated fairly in how the murder he committed was reported, but also incompetent because he could not recognize the seriousness of his conduct. However, in describing what I think was intended as an insanity defense, he asserted he had no sense of guilt for Rena. In fact, he blamed her. He said it was Rena's fault because she had been on a walk in Aruma that night. Based on all those feelings that he wasn't being treated fairly by the media, Gadson asked to transfer his trial to Tokyo. He said he would be denied a fair trial in Okinawa because all women on Okinawa have a victim's mindset, and a 6-person jury would therefore be biased. His request was denied. He received a 3-day trial at which he claimed he was not a bad person and that he didn't mean for any of this to happen. You know, because when he climbed into a car prepared to kidnap and rape a woman, any woman, he only intended to kidnap and rape somebody, not murder someone. Rena's father advocated for the death penalty, but Gadson received a sentence of life imprisonment with hard labor. From what I've found, the death penalty in Japan is usually reserved for those who have committed more than one murder. The sentence to hard labor might include manufacturing parts for automobiles or other work for which Gadson would receive some nominal, very small salary. Another Marine sentenced to hard labor said that he received a salary of less than $30 a month for his daily work. I'll note that in the election a few weeks ago, Californians were given the opportunity to make forced prison labor, or slavery, illegal. I don't believe anyone submitted an argument against it for the California Voter Guide, and I thought that in 2024, we could all at least agree that slavery was bad. Nevertheless, that measure failed. Gadson's arrest ignited the long-simmering tension on the island of Okinawa and sparked protests outside the bases. Service members committing violent sex crimes have been a problem since the post-World War II American occupation of the island, and U.S. Forces Japan began welcoming the families of service members in an effort to combat that sexual violence. These protests that Gadson's arrest sparked were not new. In 1995, for instance, following the gang rape of a 12-year-old Okinawan girl, more than 90,000 protesters came out. That protest produced a promise to close Marine Corps Air Station Futenma and to move to a less populated part of the island. Futenma remains open and active. I don't see an appeal in this case, but I also never mastered anything other than hello, goodbye, thank you, and no strawberries in Japanese. It's entirely possible there is an appeal out there, but I'd be unable to read it if it exists. So I thought instead that I'd talk about what I think is a really interesting distinction between the Japanese and American systems of criminal justice. We'll start with America. In 1966, the Supreme Court of the United States published a landmark decision entitled Miranda v. Arizona. The court, then under the leadership of Chief Justice Warren, is considered the most liberal SCOTUS thus far, and they worked hard to safeguard constitutional rights. The Warren Court is lauded for eliminating school prayer and ensuring school children are not subject to state-sponsored religion, ending the racial segregation of public schools, safeguarding interracial marriages, mandating that electoral districts be of roughly equal populations under the one-man, one-vote principle, protecting access to contraception, requiring public defenders to ensure criminal justice was, in fact, just, prohibiting prosecutors from hiding exculpatory evidence, and clarifying that free speech means free, for students, for newspapers covering political figures, for viewpoints we might not even like. In short, the Warren Court set many precedents that have served as a guide for America in issues of access to justice and, not being horrifically racist against literal school children. Ernesto Arturo Miranda had been arrested in 1963 for kidnapping and rape, which is not entirely dissimilar from the case we've covered today. Police brought him in for questioning and, after putting him in a lineup, told him that he'd been positively identified by the victim. The police then interrogated him for 2 hours without advising him of his constitutional rights. Then Miranda signed a written confession. At trial, that written confession and a retelling of his oral confession were presented to the jury, which then found Miranda guilty of kidnapping and rape. He received a sentence of 20 to 30 years in prison on each count. The issues SCOTUS took up were, first, whether the statements an individual made while subject to custodial police interrogation are admissible in a criminal trial, and second, whether procedures designed to safeguard a suspect's Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination were necessary. With the answers to those legal questions guiding the opinion, SCOTUS held that statements made during custodial police interrogations were inadmissible unless the police could demonstrate that they had used procedural safeguards effective at securing the privilege against self-incrimination. That's where the Miranda advisement that we see in every procedural comes up, informing suspects that they have the right to remain silent, and that should they waive that right, the things they say can and will be used against them in a court of law. The advisement informs the suspect that they have the right to an attorney and that if they cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided to them. That makes sense because being your own criminal defense attorney is a very bad idea. I would not advise an actual criminal defense attorney to represent themselves, and they've got the advantage of a law degree and practice. In a system where a state will prosecute you for practicing law without a license, the idea that we'd let people go unrepresented or representing themselves boggles the mind. In contrast to almost all of those safeguards, Japan has what some people refer to as a hostage justice system. There, it is legally sound to arrest, hold, and interrogate someone without charging them. Criminal suspects may be held for 23 days in solitary confinement under what Americans might call harsh conditions. During that time, they can be repeatedly interrogated. Ostensibly, Japanese law has a right to remain silent, at least technically. In practice, though, people are pressured to talk. Prosecutors strongly oppose release, even though somebody hasn't been charged, until a confession is made. 23 days of solitary confinement, only coming out for long interrogations and opportunities to confess, seems like a dangerous system. I'm not well versed in the statistics around false confessions in Japan, but were suspects held and interrogated under similar circumstances in the United States, any conviction achieved would be very vulnerable on appeal. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, please share it. I invite you to submit case suggestions and feedback to conductunbecomingpod@gmail.com or on conductunbecomingpod.com. Join me next time when we slide into misconduct. Until then, take care. Conduct Unbecoming is a podcast where I get to talk about interesting crimes and cases that involve U.S. military service members. I research, write, and produce the podcast myself. The opinions expressed are my own, and perhaps it's obvious. Conduct Unbecoming is not approved, authorized, or endorsed by the Department of Defense.